Good afternoon. Everybody's finally last entrance taking your seats. My name is David Gibson. I'm the director of the Center on Religion and Culture here at Fordham, and I want to welcome you to this special symposium, our two-part event, Reckoning and Reform, New Horizons on the Clergy Abuse Crisis. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. This is the latest in what is an ongoing series of programs at Fordham dedicated to plumbing the depths of the crisis and hopefully pointing toward some constructive paths forward. As we plan these events, we always need to be mindful that the survivors of abuse must be at the center of our concern. They're not just the subjects of our attention, but are the very protagonists of this drama, this narrative. Their views and experience must always be central, and I'd also note that even as they usually refer to themselves as survivors rather than victims, there are far too many who in fact do not survive the abuse. The wounds are so deep and lasting that it claims their lives somewhere down the road. That happens far too often, as we know. So before we start, I'd just like to take a moment of silence to remember them. Reckoning and Reform. The title of this symposium sets out our plan this evening. In order to begin to resolve the problems, we need to first understand them, to reckon with what has happened and why. The best and most impressive efforts to do that in the Catholic context has been the two reports commissioned initially by the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops and conducted by researchers at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice, right here around the corner. First was the 2004 report on the nature and scope of the problem of sexual abuse of minors by Catholic priests in the United States. And then the follow-up 2011 report, The Causes and Context of Sexual Abuse of Minors by Catholic Priests in the United States. We're truly privileged today to have the principal investigator and data analyst on those studies here with us, Karen Terry and Margaret Smith, to give us an overview and update on their research. Karen Terry is a professor in the Department of Criminal Justice at John Jay College and a faculty member in the Criminal Justice Doctoral Program at the Graduate Center, CUNY. Her research focuses on sexual offenders and victims, specifically the abuse of children in institutional settings. She's the author of Sexual Offenses and Offenders, Theory, Practice, and Policy. Margaret Leland Smith is a quantitative criminologist at the Institute for Criminal Justice Ethics at John Jay, where she teaches courses in statistics and the ethics of information technology. In addition to the continuing work on the institutional contexts of the sexual abuse of youth, her current research focus is on the social and ethical implications of the development of artificial intelligence. And I'd also note among our guests this evening, it's another expert who worked on the John Jay studies with them, Sister Katerina Schuth. There's Sister Katerina, who came in from St. Thomas University in Minnesota to be with us. Great, terrific expert on seminary education as well, which is a vital link in this whole chain of causes and contexts. Following the presentation, Peter Steinfels will lead a discussion with Karen and Maggie, and also during the presentation, please write any questions you might have on the note cards under your seats, and we'll collect them afterwards to use in our discussions. Now, on to you, Maggie and Terry. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And it is a pleasure to be here today speaking with all of you. I am Karen Terry, and Maggie and I are going to be talking today about the studies that we did for the Catholic Church, the nature and scope, and the causes and context of the problem of child sexual abuse in the Catholic Church in the United States. We are also going to talk about some of the updates that have come out since we have published our findings in those studies, both in the US and also worldwide. I would like to thank Sister Katerina Schuth for coming here as well, who did help us with the causes and context study, particularly on the issue of formation. So we began this project in 2002 when Kathleen McChesney, who is the director of the Office of Child and Youth Protection, came to John Jay and asked our then president Gerald Lynch if he thought that we could help in the investigation of this problem of child sexual abuse in the Catholic Church. In 2002, of course, was kind of the height of this crisis, as there were reports being made every day in the media, and in particular in the Boston Globe, the New York Times, the LA Times. In 2002 alone, over 2,000 reports were published in that year. And there were a number of victims who were coming forward to report the abuse in record numbers in that year. And so what we did is we knew that child sexual abuse has long been a widespread phenomenon. And we wanted to better understand the extent of this problem within the Catholic Church. Now, what we know today is that there is widespread abuse in a number of institutions where youth interact with adults, particularly in situations where adults have the ability to interact with and mentor and nurture children and adolescents. This includes a number of religious institutions, schools, childcare facilities, sports, social organizations such as the Boy Scouts of America. And so even just this week in the Atlantic, there was an article published about the extent of abuse in Jehovah's Witnesses and the systematic cover-up of that abuse by the elders. So what we're going to do is we're going to start by talking about the nature and scope study and the findings there. I'm going to turn this over to Maggie, who's going to talk to you about the data that we collected there and some of the updated findings for that, and then we'll start to talk about the causes and context.
Greetings. Happy to have a chance to talk about this information. So the challenge of the nature and scope study was what happened, when did it happen, how widespread was it, and what is the impact financially on the church. So what we were initially asked to select a sample of dioceses to study, but it was clear, although we know that sexual abuse of youth is very widespread, we had no idea what its shape would be in the church. So it wasn't possible to make a sample. And we had to ask the USCCB to require all dioceses to submit a survey on each priest or cleric who had been accused and one on each victim who had come forward. And so that's what we did. And in order to do this kind of research as professionals, as ethical professionals, we are required to protect the confidentiality of all individuals. And so the diocese and staff completed the surveys. They were sent to an independent auditor who removed all indications of the source, meaning the diocese. There were no individual names, and so then they came to us with numbers. So this process of anonymization has often been challenged, but I want to say that we would not have been able to do this work if we had not been able to guarantee that that information would not become public about not the individual specifics of a victim or a cleric or a diocese. So the response was very good, and we collected data from almost all of the sources. I'm sorry, let me go back to. So 97% of dioceses and 63% of religious institutes participated by submitting surveys. What do we know now that we didn't know then? A lot of people then said to us, well, how can we believe what the church said? If they paid for your study, well, how could it be believable? That question was asked to us many times. Since the last year of data that we got in 2002, the dioceses have been asked to report to CARA, Center for Applied Research in the Apostolate, the new allegations they received every year between 2004 and 2017. And for those who still feel that that might be not as straightforward as it should be, there are a number of commissions and studies that have taken sources directly from victims and from criminal justice or forensic sources, and so are not limited by simply the reports of the Catholic leaders. And that would include the Royal Commission in Australia, as well as the recent work produced by the Catholic Conference of German Bishops, and in Poland there's a new work. Also in the in the state of Pennsylvania, the special report gathered information from multiple sources. The nature and scope results were that approximately 4% of priests in ministry in U.S. dioceses were involved in abuse. And that many people thought that this is just an urban problem. This is just San Francisco, this is just Boston, this is just New York. But that was not the case. Throughout the country, the range of the percentage of priests accused ranged between 3 and 6% per diocese. Small ones, large ones, urban ones, and not. We received information on 10,667 victims, and the diocesan priest percentage in terms of those in service in this period from 1950 to 2002, 4.6% of diocesan priests had received an allegation of abuse. In terms of the religious institutes, that percentage is 2.7. What do we know now? If we compare the percentages that are produced by the other work, 7% of priests in service in the Catholic Church in Australia. This is based on a similar survey that they carried out of their within their church hierarchy. In Germany, 4.4%. In Poland, we don't have a percentage, right? Just the the report was just released, 362 priests. So the percentages are not dissimilar. In the nature and scope, we found that 2/3 were diocesan priests, mostly pastors or associate pastors. The age range was very wide, from some young priests to some very elderly. So the term generalist here, that means that the victims were not always one particular age group or gender, but in fact, those priests with more than one victim often had heterogeneous victims with different sex and different age. Pedophilia was not common, this has now been confirmed by several other studies, but less than 5% would have fulfilled the clinical definition of pedophilia. However, the duration of offending, although approximately half had only one known victim, there were many cases where the abuse went on for years and years. And so the average duration is almost 5 years for those who had more than one allegation. We know in criminal justice as professionals that many people commit one minor crime or one crime and are arrested. And then a very small number of people commit many, many crimes and are arrested over and over again. This pattern, which has been consistent over time and in forensic research, is replicated here. In nature and scope, 3.5% of priests had 10 or more victims, and they were responsible for more than a quarter of the total of the almost 11,000 victims. So it is a really significant problem that this situation that exists in the world of deviance exists in this situation as well, in terms of those who deal with youth. The differences between those we call serial predators and others have to do with how long the behavior persisted, diversity of gender and age, more and more deliberate grooming of victims, and the longer delay on the part of victims for disclosure of the abuse. This is not surprising, given the amount of time that a victim had spent in an abusive relationship. I mean, I say that term relationship, but for those for whom it went on for years, it was a form of relationship, of abuse. So here is what we knew. This is the distribution of age and gender. What we have represented in the next few graphs are remarkably consistent percentages. And what that says about what we know about the truly unknown dimension of this problem of sexual abuse of youth, specifically in the Catholic Church, is that we see the same percentages repeated again and again. What that means is that what we are getting are samples from an underlying but unknown, a problem whose underlying dimensions are unknown but can be regularly represented. So 80.9% of victims that we knew of in 2002 were male, and almost 60% between 10 and 14. When we look at what the victims who have disclosed their abuse between 2004 and 2017, we find that the percentages are exactly the same. I want to reinforce this. These are 8,645 victims who have come forward after our research was published in the annual reports that are carried out through the USCCB and tallied by CARA. The percentages are exactly the same. What else do we know that's new? We know that most victims, were not able to come forward immediately, but waited for some time to be able to discuss or reveal what had happened to them. So in the John Jay study, 10% waited 1 year. In Australia, 5% reported within 1 year. The Australian lags in reporting were more pronounced than in the United States, but the pattern is similar. What happened? Well, we anticipated at John Jay that we would receive reports that would be false and that would be obviously untrue, or that would be about simply a bad touch or an extreme hug or a flirt or something like that, but that was not the case. The reports we received were substantially about explicit sexual abuse. That means explicit sexual touch with an erotic component on the part of the abuser. This is echoed in terms of Germany. 80% were hands-on offenses, and in Australia as well. The age group that we found, the adolescent males, this is replicated again in the Pennsylvania diocese data, in the German data, and in in Australia, perhaps a little younger in Australia. I should comment that the Australian abuse, a substantial amount of it took place in residential schools, which may account somewhat for the younger age. But the patterns are similar. We have vulnerable adolescents, primarily male adolescents, being victimized in their homes or in the homes of or residences of the priests whom they trusted. So this is a famous slide that we published, and it shows you the total dimension of the abuse for the period of 1950 to 2002, with a block around what we call the peak of abuse, the time period that created the highest level of abuse. What do we know now? The first two slides are equivalent in height. So the first one in blue is what we knew in 2002. The second on the right in blue is what we know after 2002 from the United States. These show that even though the time has gone forward, the pattern of abuse remains in the same place. The Pennsylvania incidence is in purple, and the Australia incidence, these are the events of abuse counted in the years in which they began. So although we collected data directly from the church, and that people thought that perhaps what we had was not accurate, it does look like it has been substantially confirmed by the work that we know, by the studies that have been carried out in the intervening period of time. So this is when the abuse was revealed. So the box at the bottom shows the peak of abuse when it was taking place between 74 and 82. And this spike is in 2002 when 3,399 individuals came forward. And so this discrepancy is one that often is overlooked when the discussions take place about what was done. It's a question of what was done based on what was known. Now, here's a complicated slide. So people still have questions about and say to us, well, as time goes forward, more victims will come forward because the events would have happened more recently. This is showing the number of allegations that CARA received each year or every 3 years between 2004 and 2017, and the percentage that began before 1985. So time is going by, but the reports are being brought in for abuse that happened. What happened? Oh. Sorry. That happened many years ago. And the current abuse, which is the list of abuse after 2000, is rising somewhat, but is still very small. So this question of disclosure and reporting is a major pattern that we discovered, and it's one that we fear will also be applicable in other environments where youth are connected to adults. So in summary, what we found from Nature and Scope appears to be stable in terms of when things happened and when they were known. Male adolescents are the primary victims. More than half of priests had a single known victim. This has been replicated in Germany and in Australia as well. The amount of damage done by persistent offenders remains to be a significant challenge. And although most incidents of abuse were substantiated in the Nature and Scope data, it is becoming more difficult for CARA and for the diocese to do that substantiation because people are no longer present. But when I reviewed all the CARA reports, a very small fraction have been found to be false, a very small fraction. And we think that the current studies that gather data directly from victims and directly from forensic sources do not produce anything that is inconsistent with what the church reported and that we summarized. So then we engaged some consultants, Professor James Kelly, Emeritus from Fordham, Sister Katarina Schuth from St. Thomas, and other graduate students to help us work on the reasons for what would explain the peak in behavior. The most profound question: why was the harm of the abuse not understood? Why was it not understood in 1985? Why was it not understood in 1995? And are there risk factors or individual characteristics that would allow the diocese or others to identify people who would be potential sex offenders? How has seminary education changed? And what role did the church leadership play? Finally, how do we understand the situations in which this abuse arose? We gathered a very substantial amount of information using analyses of society, analyses of seminary education, surveys with priests who had abused and those who had not, Eugene Kennedy's archival data from his 1991 study. We coded his original data. And then the surveys of survivors, victim assistance coordinators, and clinical files. We were granted access to the clinical data in a very complicated way that guaranteed the review of the files would be done by the employees of the clinics, but they would then fill out the surveys and give them to us. This allowed us to have a glimpse at much more expanded information about the men who were sent to treatment by their diocese. And finally, we carried out conversations and surveys with bishops and other diocesan leaders and with victim advocates. So what is the reason for the rise in incidence and the peak between 1978 and 1982? This is also the peak of massive resignation from the ministry. Why? Because there was a change in society that led people to expect more individual freedom in sexuality. These are what we call social indicators, aspects that can be measured in society that indicate underlying changes in attitude. Birth to single mothers increase, divorce increases, crime, drug use, and disorder all increase during this period of time. It was once thought that what goes on in the Catholic Church is different than what goes on in the society, but we did not find that to be the case. So this is a complicated slide I added to show the red line at the bottom is the count of individuals who are diagnosed with pedophilia. You'll see that it doesn't change. When individuals have psychological disposition to abuse, it is not something that's affected in the changes in society over time. That's a straight line. We worked with Professor Symbolic, who had a thesis about the fact that there is, he hypothesized that there was something called a phebophilia, which was a specific attraction to adolescent males of a certain age. The green line shows the cases that would have fulfilled that categorization, an exclusive attraction to males of a certain pubescent age. The blue line is those who had one single accusation of abuse. And the most significant curve at the top is what we call the generalists or the multiples. These are individuals who had abuse incidents with males and females, or with younger children and older children, with adolescents and with 17-year-olds. And so it looks to us as though the behaviors that are most affected by society are the ones that are least categorizable by psychological disposition. So why did it go down in the 80s? What happened so that the incidence dropped? Well, in many ways, this is a reaction to the changes between the 1960s and the 1970s. We have the recognition of familial abuse, the recognition for the first time that it is unlawful to strike your wife, that it is unlawful to strike your child. You forget that these things were not against the law in major parts of the United States in the 1960s. So we had major changes, moving from a single statute for rape to a much wider framework for understanding sexual abuse. And beginning in 1985 with the notorious case of Gilbert Gauthier, there was recognition of the problem within the church. There was advocacy by former victims, some of whom were priests, Father Doyle, and internal discussions initiated by the USCCB that began in the 90s and explain in part the wider recognition of the harm within the widespread Catholic Church, and also the increase in reporting at that time. So an interesting, the people who were ordained in earlier years are still offending many years later. But the people who are ordained later, in the 70s and 80s, are offending much more quickly. We take this to be another indication of the impact of social influence. And so it's important to recognize that these were distinct differences in the behavior. So Sister Katerina guided us through the work on seminary education, but seminaries expanded after the war. Opportunities for young Catholics were not as widespread as they are today. We found that there was suspicion that those who went to minor seminaries would be more represented in abuse. We didn't find that to be the case. And that as seminary education changed, we saw a change in development in teaching of human formation. What did the clinical data tell us? It told us what all the criminologists who work in this field understand, that you cannot predict abusive sexual behavior. We found in one study that those who had been sexually victimized themselves as children were slightly more likely to abuse. But in general, there were not factors that would allow potential abusers to be identified in advance. One of the most striking studies is that the clinical data revealed that 80% of the men who had abused minors had also, and generally, subsequently, been involved with adult females. So this is something that has not gotten widespread recognition, but it does show that what we have here is a response perhaps to loneliness, to a need for intimacy, of a lack of the ability to respect boundaries, but it was not widespread pedophilia. So those who had sexual experience before coming to the seminary were more likely to have sexual experience after the seminary or after ordination, but with adults. And so there was discussion of the fact that there was written documentation by scholars that the conversation about homosexuality was present in seminaries in the 1980s. But that is when the incidence of abuse declined. So actually, some of our respondents said that it was great to have the conversation, even if it was prompted by those who define themselves as homosexual. So you have behavior when you have no discussion. And then when you have conversation and the ability to talk about human sexuality, you have a decrease, a rapid decline in the incidence of abuse following that period of time. Or the abuse of those educated in the seminary who were ordained in the 80s drops precipitously. Is this where we, okay, so I'm gonna ask, Karen's gonna come back to talk about the response within the church to the allegations of abuse and then to move on to the wider dimensions of this problem in the society we live in.
All right. So what do we know about the responses by the church leadership to these allegations of abuse? What we do know is that they were largely inadequate, but we also know that the types of responses changed over time. So Maggie talked about 1985 as a pivotal year. So one of the things that we looked at in the causes and context study is if the leaders' responses to allegations of abuse changed before and after that time period. We know that 840 cases of abuse had been reported to the diocese prior to 1985, even though we know now that much of the abuse that had taken place had already happened by that time. These were just reported much later. We know that prior to 1985, the primary focus by leaders was on helping the priests, not the victims. And often this meant sending them for treatment, either spiritual or psychological treatment. We also know that many were reprimanded and returned to ministry at that time. In fact, 35% of priests with allegations of abuse between 1950 and 1979 were reprimanded and returned to ministry. But only 4% were reprimanded and returned to ministry by the year 2000. So again, this is a shift in the type of responses over time. Now, by 1985, we know that there were widespread discussions about sexual abuse of minors amongst a body of bishops. We know that there had been sexual abuse cases reported in at least half of the dioceses by that time. There was an ad hoc committee on sexual abuse that was created, and the bishops published the Cardinal's Commission on Clerical Sexual Misconduct with Minors in 1992 that was led by Cardinal Bernardine. That said, some of the recommendations that were made by others, such as Father Doyle and victim advocates, were largely ignored even at that time. Now, because of the church's lack of response on an institutional level to victims of abuse, a number of advocacy groups began to form, such as SNAP, which was founded in 1988, held their first conference in 1991. Later, we see the creation of Voice of the Faithful. I believe they formed in the year 2000. But this is also in response to the lack of response on an institutional level to victims of abuse. And despite this intensive work by individuals and advocacy groups, there was little change over a decade from that period of 1985 to 1993. What we did see is the publication in 1993 of Restoring Trust, which published the 5 principles. And these resulted from a lot of that work that was done by some of those church leaders at that time, such as Cardinal Bernardine. So what are the 5 principles? It's to respond promptly to these allegations of abuse. It's to remove the offender when there is sufficient evidence. It's to comply with all of the obligations of civil law. It's to reach out to victims and their families and communicate with them, and deal as openly as possible about the abuse with members of the community. So unfortunately, despite the good intentions of these 5 principles, they were not implemented consistently across dioceses. And by 2002, many of the bishops that we spoke to did not even know what these principles were. So what happened after this time, between 1993 and 2002? Many of the things that we saw prior to 1985. We still saw a lack of follow-up on reports of abuse. Many priests were still being returned to ministry, often after treatment and without supervision. There is still very little communication with civil authorities or with the Vatican, where the only times canonical procedures were initiated were in the most severe cases of repeated abuse. And there are some leaders, including cardinals, who even denied knowledge of sexual abuse within their diocese under oath, even though we know now that allegations of abuse had been reported at that time. So what happened post-2002? Well, we know that meaningful change did happen, but it was slow and inconsistent. There are a number of policies that resulted from the charter, in particular safe environment training and audits, external audits, to ensure that there's compliance by all the dioceses with the various types of safe environment training for the protection of children and young people. We also know that there are 181 dioceses today that have released names of all the credibly accused priests. That is about 92% of dioceses in the United States, and those are all online. So those are accessible lists of credibly accused priests from almost all of the dioceses in the United States. And we also see that there are now criminal and canonical investigations of very high-level bishops and cardinals who were accused of abuse themselves or thought to be covering up allegations of abuse. And there are also many civil investigations into abuse in a number of states in the United States today. So what's our focus in 2019? It's accountability of leaders. So the focus has shifted from the abuse itself, the abusers itself, to those who covered up or allegedly covered up the allegations of abuse, tried to prevent disclosure, and really their responsibility for failure of supervision. So again, looking at very specific examples of failure of leadership, we have McCarrick, Cardinal Wuerl's resignation as examples of what we've seen just in the last year. And we know that there are currently 13 states and the District of Columbia looking into investigations of abuse and the cover-up. So what are the recommendations and policies at this time? Well, throughout the 2000s, the abuse by Catholic priests was viewed almost exclusively as an American problem in the US. Even though this is despite the fact that there were patterns evident in the Canadian Catholic Church that had come out before that, but it had not received the same level of media attention as it did in the US. But by 2010, we began to see reports emerging in South America and Europe and Australia about widespread abuse in the Catholic Church. And there are a number of commissions that were formed, there are a number of reports that were made, and there were a number of researchers who began to study this problem worldwide. And here's an example of some of the reports that have been issued as a result of that work. So in the Australian Royal Commission report that Maggie mentioned earlier on the role of organizational, cultural, and child sexual abuse, The author Palmer and his colleagues described an organizational culture as the assumptions, values, beliefs, and norms that are associated with organizations. So one of the cultural factors that scholars have associated with the organizational response to abuse is a hierarchical structure within the church and the priest and bishop's power and authority within the church. So each diocese is basically its own entity, and the bishops have much discretion in how they responded to individual problems within those dioceses. And they had the power to make nearly unilateral decisions and that were rarely questioned. So even though the most serious cases were handled through internal mechanisms within the church, they were not handled by external civil authorities. And this is particularly true prior to the 1980s. There were the leadership's use of these internal mechanisms and lack of transparency about the responses they were taking was one of the most critical flaws in the church's response to abuse at this time. And again, most importantly, little attention was given to the harm that was caused to victims. So several reports called the sexual abuse crisis in the Catholic Church a moral failure, not just because of the harm to the thousands of youth, but because the priest abusers and others who knew about or suspected that this abuse was taking place failed to live up to the most basic of their pastoral commitments, which is the care of the most vulnerable in their community. So Palmer, in his report for the Royal Commission, identified 5 factors that he believes inhibit the response to abuse victims from an organization. And one he described as motivated blindness. So he said this is the unconscious drive to ignore information that would require them to act or take actions. So for example, maybe they're not accurately identifying some of the grooming behaviors that they saw or some of the abuse that they might have seen occurring. Second, he noted the cognitive dissonance, which is this uncomfortable feeling you have that is a disconnection between the good person that you know that you're hearing about committing these bad acts and that disconnect. Third, he said that people tend to support those with whom they interact and those within the organization. They also have an in-group bias, where members consider themselves better or different than non-members, and they have a sense of moral superiority or prone to groupthink or discount outsiders' criticisms. And finally, the more power the perpetrator has, the less effective the institutional response is going to be to the victims. And this is something that's really critical that we've seen in a variety of different types of organizations, not just in the Catholic Church. So what did these commissions recommend? They issued largely consistent recommendations. All of those commissions and reports from all of those different countries over a period of time all had very similar recommendations. They said that you need to respond quickly and fully to allegations of abuse. Those actions have to be transparent, and you really have to focus on the well-being of the victim, develop this restorative process for those who were abused. And in order to prevent abuse from happening in the future, you need to improve formation and ensure consistent implementation of safeguarding policies. So the Catholic Church implemented a number of abuse prevention policies that were based upon those recommendations. And a lot of these policies focused on micro-level or individual factors. So focused on individual people. So background checks of people who are applying to come into the priesthood, psychological screening, education and training of individuals within the church. And they also implemented a number of these situational crime prevention policies. So why is that situational context so important? Well, situational factors play a critical role because abuse often occurs in private. And as Maggie noted, the most common place for abuse to occur that we found within the Nature and Scope study and that was replicated in other studies is the home of the priest or also in the home of the victim. And diocesan priests tend to live alone in the parish residence. There's very little supervision, if any, and they have high levels of isolation, very little external oversight. And we found that at times they were bringing youths back to the parish residence where they were abusing them as there was very little supervision. And opportunity can also help to explain the large number of male victims within the Catholic Church. And so we know that there is a lot of opportunity for priests to interact with adolescent males. And they served as altar boys. They went on retreats and spent time overnight with the priests in various situations. This often did not happen with girls. And something that's particularly interesting to note is when girls were able to serve as altar servers for the first time in 1983, we started to see a shift in the gender of victims, so that by the mid-1990s, the gender of victims was almost equal between boys and girls. So again, you see that major shift at that time when there was more access suddenly to females. So the situational crime prevention model focuses on preventing opportunities for abuse to occur. And that is particularly important because it's not possible to screen out all potential offenders. And when we see Janet Warren, who is a professor of psychiatry and neurobehavioral sciences, she evaluated the Boy Scout files. And she stated that it must be recognized that no mental health professional, scientific researcher, law enforcement agency, or youth-serving organization has ever created a scientifically valid profile of a probable child sex offender. It's an unfortunate reality that child sex offenders, until they act, are indistinguishable from other members of society. No one has yet designed a reliable checklist or similar document to flag persons who will someday go on to abuse children. So the situational crime prevention model works to reduce the vulnerability of potential targets largely by educating them, educating children, educating the families, educating the community about abuse and what it is and how to respond. And the policies also enhance guardianship of potential victims through policies such as too deep leadership, meaning that individual children and adolescents are not allowed to be alone with a single individual adult. And that there has to be at least 2 adults with a child at any given time. And so while situational factors can help explain how the priests had or created opportunities to abuse, it's really these cultural factors that can help explain how the abuse was able to persist over a long period of time and why it was not recognized or reported. So Palmer referred to this as an organizational culture, which refers to the assumptions, values, beliefs, and norms that are associated with the organization. He called the church an institutionalized organization, where members take on the identity of the organization, protect it from criticism, overlook negative issues within to protect that external reputation. And threats to the organization's image are perceived as issues that need to be managed, really to minimize their negative effect. And so we look at some of these macro level factors like the change in culture, and these are very challenging issues to change. It requires a change in the culture of all the people who are involved in that community. But there's variability in buy-in. That is what we have seen in the church throughout the United States and in other countries as well. And it's particularly challenging when you have oversight that is externally imposed, for instance, from the courts, from insurance companies, or even from the audits, where they're being told what to do, but the change has not necessarily developed from within. So we know that change in institutions can happen, but institutional change is slow, and there has to be a commitment to reform by the organizational leaders. But the Catholic Church faces similar challenges to other institutions. So we know that prevention of abuse is a critical factor in all youth-serving organizations, again, that we've looked at over the past decade. As Palmer said, there are no comprehensive large-scale studies on the frequency of child sexual abuse across the full range of organizations delivering services to children and young people. So one of the questions that we've been asked is, what does the problem in the Catholic Church look like compared to other institutions? And the answer is it's very hard to say because we do not have comparable data in any other institution other than the Catholic Church. All right. What we do know is that there's a recognition of problematic behavior that often results from high-profile cases or court cases, and that many of these organizations do experience similar problems and have similar institutional responses to what we witnessed in the Catholic Church. So for context, I'm going to talk a bit about what has happened within the Boy Scouts. So since the 1920s, the Boy Scouts has kept files on individuals that they deem ineligible to join the Boy Scouts as volunteers. And these are called their ineligible files, or IV files. There have been more than 50 significant lawsuits against the Boy Scouts of America for allegations of sexual abuse, and a number of these a number of these IV files were required to be released by the courts as a result of these cases. And in particular, in 2012, the Oregon Supreme Court ordered the release of files held by the BSA from 1965 to 1985. And these had been submitted as evidence in a case in 2010. So based on the release of those files, as well as a few others that had been released from other court cases, John Jay now has a total of 2,440 of these IV files that have been released as a result of civil suits. And these cases span the years of 1965 to 91. So what we know is that most of those who had allegations of abuse within the Boy Scouts were scoutmasters or other volunteers. They had mostly male victims. Much of the abuse occurred in the same places as we found in the Catholic Church, in the home of the abusers, on retreats, or during other activities that had been planned by the abusers. And the abusers used emotional manipulation, much in the same way that they did in the church. We also know that about half of the abusers had one victim, again, very similar to that 55% that we saw in the Catholic Church, and 3.5% had 10 or more victims, where we saw, again, in the Catholic Church that 3.2% had 10 or more victims. So again, you're looking at a small number of individuals who are responsible for a large amount of the abuse that happened in that organization as well. So what we know is that, the files that we have cover this period, the peak period of abuse, but we don't have files prior to 1965, and we don't have files after 1991 that might show some of the changes that resulted from the Boy Scouts. So we can't compare it completely to the information that we have from the Catholic Church. But we do know that, like the Catholic Church, it is an institutionalized organization, or has been called an institutionalized organization. We also know that, just like the church, there was a focus on the offenders instead of the victims. Many of those offenders left, went through treatment, and were later allowed to join again. Much of the information was not shared with victims or the families of victims, and again, there is a concern about lack of transparency and trust. So I also would like to use as an example case of allegations in sports. So there is a significant problem of child sexual abuse and abuse of adolescents in sports, from club levels to the Olympic level, from team sports to individual sports. And there have been a number of high-profile cases that have come out in the media. So awareness, there's not a lot of mass data that is available within sports. A lot of our attention is drawn to this through individual cases that come out in the media, such as the case of Larry Nassar. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with the case of Larry Nassar, but this is a particularly egregious case of an individual who had over 300 allegations of abuse from 1992 over a period of decades, where he abused a number of athletes at Michigan State University, as well as Olympic-level gymnasts. And this was largely unreported, unnoticed, and when it was reported, it was not acted upon. And as a result of as a result of this case, there are a number of experiences that have happened with both Michigan State University where the president had to resign and was later also indicted, as well as USA Gymnastics. The entire board had to resign, including the CEO, Steve Penny, who was later charged with allegations of covering up the crime. So again, very poor response on an organizational level across multiple organizations in this case. So we know that the perpetrators in sports are often leaders in their sports. They're often the best coaches, the most powerful, and they have a lot of opportunities to abuse with this one-on-one mentorship, even in team sports. Many of the victims have a fear of reporting for concerns about retaliation and inability to be able to continue within their sport and proceed to the highest levels of that sport. And for organizations, what we find is that their priority is often athletic performance, winning, and gold medals. That's what we saw in the case of USA Gymnastics. And it's the protection of their reputation. So what have been the responses to abuse in sport? Well, the U.S. Olympic Committee implemented a safe sport program in 2012. It's the Olympic Committee's response to recognize, reduce, and respond to misconduct in sport. And it requires all of the national governing bodies to create athlete safety programs that include what type of conduct is prohibited. It requires them to have criminal background checks for anyone who's going to work with youth. It requires education and training of everyone within a sport who's a member of the organization. It requires them to provide guidelines for reporting and some method of enforcement of reporting. So I have personally had an opportunity to work with one of the sports that has helped to implement one of these safe sport programs, and I've worked with the sport of U.S. figure skating to help create those guidelines, and I've been able to experience and see firsthand what some of the successes and some of the challenges are. And not surprisingly, what we see is a lot of similarities, again, between this sports and other types of organizations. So because of the intensive education and training that it's provided its members, what we do see is we see a shift in the culture. So safe sport is now part of the common language within sports. Every single person who is a member of any sport is required to participate in some kind of training. There's much increased awareness and reporting of various types of behaviors, including boundary violating behaviors. However, there are a lot of challenges that they face. In particular, this desire to win often outweighs the safety risks. And parents are the ones who are often placing their athletes in harmful situations. So just in the last week or so, we had some parents who called the U.S. Figure Skating Organization and asked how they could possibly, is there a way in which they could have their children continue to take lessons from an individual who had been arrested for child sexual abuse of a young girl. He was arrested at the ice rink while he was teaching a lesson and has a court date pending. And still these parents said, but he's our coach and he's a national level coach and we want to still take lessons from him. So you see how parents are putting their children at risk even when it is known. Yes, and that happened last week. So there's also, what we find is there's a lack of enforcement on a local level. So, we can implement policies, but we don't know, for instance, if the local club is enforcing the locker room policy. It's very difficult to know how much this is being enforced on the ground. And we also know that abuse is still significantly underreported for all of those reasons that we mentioned. And we also know in terms of the U.S. Olympic Committee generally, the implementation by sport varies, much like the implementation by diocese varied. So what can we take away? So importantly, our understanding of child sexual abuse changed over time. Okay, and many of the abuse incidents occurred decades ago. We tend to view these through a lens of what we know now about child sexual abuse, including the devastating harm that can be caused to victims. And this is not to reduce the level of responsibility of abuse-serving organizations that they had to protect children from harm, but to better understand why the abuse might not have been recognized at that time and reported as it might be today. And when abuse was recognized, it was often considered an institutional and not it's considered an individual rather than an institutional problem. So the abuser was considered a bad apple, but not the product of the organizational environment in which the abuse took place. And as such, a lot of the institutions responded on a case-by-case basis. And organizational cultures provide these opportunities for abuse to occur. And there are many barriers to identifying, responding to, and reporting abuse. And not only were there low levels of reporting abuse, but when it was reported, it was often led to this cognitive dissonance amongst the organizational leaders. Many of the abusers were among the most prolific in the organization, whether it be the church or other organizations. And many of the leaders did what they could to protect the organization from outsiders or from ruining the reputation of their organization, what they perceived to be the single bad apple. We know that organizational cultures are very difficult to change, requiring more than just the idea of a policy. So we can see from the uneven implementation of the 5 principles in the Catholic Church that led to no significant improvements really in child protection. It was only after the scandal was fully recognized a decade later that the bishops as a body made significant efforts to change their culture and focus on the protection of children from harm. We know that for real change to happen, the welfare of children and adolescents must be the top priority of any organization. And it can't just be on winning sports or protecting the organization from lawsuits or protecting the reputation. It has to be on the best interests of the children and their health. And instituting these prevention programs that train staff is essential to curtail any of these organizational behaviors that enable the abuse to happen. Training must be about more than just procedures. It has to reflect an organizational culture in which everyone expects abuse to be reported and allegations to be properly investigated. And accountability of the organizational leaders and transparency of their actions is critical for change to happen. We have to do more than just enact policies. The full implementation of the policies, supported by leaders of the organization and with buy-in from constituents, signifies that there is a change in the culture and that the organization as a whole deems sexual misconduct unacceptable. So as O'Hare stated in America Magazine in 2004, that policies and procedures will only be effective if bishops maintain a commitment to meaningful reform and vigilant enforcement that outlasts the immediate crisis and becomes ingrained in the character of the church itself. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen and Margaret, for a terrific presentation of the facts as we know them and the context and the data. And now we're going to welcome Peter Steinfels to lead a discussion with Karen and Maggie. This should be short. Peter Steinfels needs no introduction, but I need a reason to exist. So here we go. Peter co-founded the Center on Religion and Culture back in 2004 along with his wife, Margaret O'Brien Steinfels. He's a longtime Catholic journalist who not only edited Commonweal magazine, but was for years the religion writer at the New York Times, where he covered the clergy sexual abuse scandal long before there was a spotlight investigation by the Boston Globe. Peter's been at this for a long time and knows the terrain, as he also demonstrated in his recent magnum opus on the Pennsylvania grand jury report in Commonweal magazine. Peter?
Thank you very much, and thank you, our John Jay scholars, for not only their presentation now, but the years of research and work that lies beneath it. It's been a tremendous service. It's very hard to absorb in short order some of the things that you've been telling us. I have a question that is oriented a little bit about perhaps some of the controversial aspects of your work. And my first question is, among I don't know whether you want to deputize one or the other of you to answer it, or both have different views. Among all the findings that you have produced, what, in your view, seems to have encountered the most resistance, either among the Catholic faithful in general or the public?
Well, I think that the thing that I get the most questions about is this issue of whether it is an ongoing problem or whether it's a problem that existed primarily in the peak years between the late 60s and the early 1980s. We had skepticism among those we worked with at John Jay as to whether this was the case, and we continually get problems. We continually get questions that say, but people just haven't come forward yet. But I'm a quant, and I can't look at the numbers any other way than to say that if every year when the new reports of abuse come forward, they are concentrated in that period of time before 1985. And so I think this is the one thing that I have had the most resistance to. It's partly because I think that people are it is not normal that we think of ourselves as shaped by public views. We don't really think about the impact of social attitudes on our individual lives. We may think about them on the lives of others, but it's hard to internalize, but the data is pretty clear that the majority of the abuse did happen in the past, at least as far as the United States and Australia is concerned. Other countries haven't released the distribution yet, but I believe it would not surprise me to see if it were confirmed as well.
I would second that. I have also received a number of questions saying exactly the same thing, but more people are going to come forward. I would also add that for the causes and context study, we worked with a mathematician who did 3 different types of estimation modeling to look at the data that we had, and also found that that peak was stable. And so we were confident when we released the report in that finding. But again, that is something that is questioned by many people. And I would also add that I think there are a lot of people who look at some of the findings and say, but this is a homosexual problem, you're wrong. Or this is a problem of celibacy, you're wrong. And so those are, I'd say, the other 2 aspects that people have challenged us on.
So one of the things that I would say is that it's also really difficult for us to accept the extent of unwanted sexual approach from adults that adolescents experience. When these questions when surveys began to ask these questions in the 1960s, the percentage of women who said that they had unwelcome sexual approach from adults was over 30%, was 40%. I mean, people couldn't believe the results. When female graduate students were surveyed, a majority had experienced unwelcome sexual approach from adults. Now that this situation the same question is being asked of boys in surveys, there's a lot of variability, but the results come in between 15 and 40%. This is a very widespread behavior. It is clear that adolescent males and females are found to be attractive by adults in a very widespread way, and that people find it difficult to conform their behavior and make excuses for abusive behavior. But the dimensions of this are such that it should put to rest any questions about celibacy.
Related to that, maybe you may have already spoken to this sufficiently, so just brush me off. It seems to be the question of looking at this issue in terms of the Catholic Church specifically, or the Catholic Church in relationship to the larger social and cultural setting. And I have the impression that the resistance that I've observed among Catholics is to the latter approach, that they want to deal with issues like destabilization of Vatican II, or teachings on sexual morality or homosexuality, questions of recently posed about the church leaders having double lives and therefore being reluctant to take disciplinary action against suspected abusers. But that's one approach. And then both of you have spoken about the crucial character to your studies of the larger approach. And I don't know whether you want to add anything to that, but that's what I...
Well, John Jay has experienced a sexual abuse crisis of some magnitude, and I can tell you that we feel pretty strongly about it. So it doesn't surprise me that Catholics feel strongly about the characteristics of the abuse happening within the faith community that they're a part of. But it's difficult to, well, I would say that I guess the answer for me is that our work did not enable us to answer that question in the way that you're posing it. And we are trained as social scientists, and we think about things in terms of what's going on in the society, and are not really equipped to answer the questions for within the church.
The second question I'd like to pose to you, it's probably more relevant to your work on where we're going forward, but it's also relevant to the data that you presented, is essentially the globalization of the sex abuse crisis. It's now seen in multiple places. Pope Francis' missteps in regard to Chile seems to have posed that, and now reports from every continent, Latin America, Poland, France, whatever, are all blurred together in a way. And how do you see this as analysts and scholars? How do you see that as posing a problem for your work?
I mean, one thing I would say is I think there is a problem of sexual misconduct within the Catholic Church, and I think that it has been responded to in inappropriate ways in many cases. And it's not just in the U.S., it is globally, and they've had inadequate responses in nearly every country. And that's to say that is similar to what we are finding as responses in other organizations. One thing that does make the Catholic Church unique, again, from a social scientist perspective, or from the perspective of someone who's looking at this problem within a single institution, is it is the only institution worldwide that has data like this, where they are able to look back for decades, for 50 years, 60 years, 70 years, to find out what those problems are and what the responses were to that problem. So I don't know what the responses are to the problem of sexual abuse in schools for the last 70 years. I don't know what the problems are within other types of social organizations in these various countries over the last 70 or 80 years, because we don't have any of that data. And that's one of the reasons why, again, we can't compare the Catholic Church directly to any other institution, because we do not have any comparable data in any other institution. And I think one thing that's also important to realize is, even in cases where we do know about sexual abuse problems, it's often just what has been reported to the police, or that has resulted in some type of criminal arrest or sentence. And what we have in the Catholic Church is a vast amount of data of abuse that happened years and years ago that has not gone through the criminal justice system. So this is not a forensic example of information. So again, we can't compare it to any other sample of data that we have in any other type of institution. So it's hard for us to say how other institutions have responded. And again, there are no other institutions that I can think of that have a leader in one place that kind of oversees what has happened globally in all these various institutions worldwide. So again, it's such a unique institution in that sense that it's very challenging to evaluate it in comparison to other types of responses.
We know that many other institutions have investigated this problem. We know that the New York school system investigates itself. We know that hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of teachers sit in a room and can't teach because they have allegations of sexual abuse that are not sufficiently documented to enable them to be fired, but they are just in limbo. Everyone knows, this is wide knowledge in New York. We know that other organizations have conducted studies within as the Jehovah's Witnesses, but that they didn't release it or they fought the results. Karen pointed this out earlier, we are perhaps moving into a new situation where victims and survivors can count on a more affirmative response and fellowship and recognition and ameliorative response, restoration. I think this is perhaps a beginning of a new direction, and we'll see what comes from this. If this enables us to recognize this harm, the harm of actions against weaker people, and enable those youth and others to resist and to understand the harm and to speak it out as harm, and see and expect to get an affirmative response, has not been the case in the past.
I would just add one thing. It's been very telling, the work that I've done with the Olympic sports. And once the widespread education and training of members of the organizations took place, one thing that we started to see was a vast amount of reporting. And so I think that it's important to think about that in the context of the church as well. So as we have increased a lot of these safeguarding policies and implemented a lot of this safe environment training, and we're starting to educate people about what is abuse and what situations does abuse occur, that people are starting to be more vocal about that, not just about what's being done to them, but about what they are seeing. And so I do think this is a slightly different era than we have had before in the church.
Regarding globalization, different countries and different regions are not in sync with the United States in terms of this problem coming to the fore and being widely examined and so on. Likewise, with the reports on which you depended, could you say a little bit more about, are they really parallel or comparable, or do they themselves need to be examined? Are they beyond criticism? They're gathered in very different ways?
Very different ways, absolutely. So first of all, one thing that we find is that many of the commissions that I mentioned and ad hoc committees that came together were created based on a high-profile case. And that's also really what happened here in 2002. We had the Boston Globe reporting. We also had a high-profile case of John Gagan at that time, who was a very prolific abuser who, as his actions came to the forefront, we started to get more attention about abuse in the Catholic Church in the United States at that time. So there's a confluence of factors that led to our knowledge about abuse in the U.S. in that year 2002. And that's when we saw that being a really critical moment. So what we see in Europe and South America is really from 2010 onwards, when we started to see, again, a number of these high-profile incidents that were occurring that led to a lot of the investigations that we started to see from that point on. Now, some of the reports that I mentioned, again, were not systematically collecting data in the way that we did for the nature and scope study or the causes and context study. These are commissions who often spoke to some of the individuals involved, who looked into the institutions, looked at some records, but again, not in a systematic way in which research scholars necessarily do. So those commissions that made those recommendations and issued those findings, they did have different types of methods for evaluating the problem in the church in their country at that time. But remarkably, they came to a lot of the same conclusions. And so, again, that's where we're starting to see just a lot of that organizational culture that was playing a role in allowing the abuse to persist.
Okay, I want to comment on that because I actually think that when we refused to create a sample of dioceses and required everyone to turn in surveys, it was because we didn't know anything about the phenomenon, the social phenomenon, the unknown shape. But now we have that information, and so the sampling and sampling done in Australia and in Germany and Australia both used multiple sources: German study, clinical work, interviews with victims, outreach to victims, surveys of dioceses, interview with bishops. I think both of those national studies seem strong to me. And I do think that having a baseline of knowledge allows for work that is not as comprehensive, in the sense that not every diocese was maybe forced to fill it out, still allows for comparable work, or still is an authentically reliable way to get a picture of the abuse in that particular country.
I just want to say I agree with Maggie's comment. And generally, when we look at the scope of studies that have been conducted or reports that have been released, it is a study in Germany and the Royal Commission's report and the John Jay reports that have done the most extensive evaluation of the problem within a particular country.
As a critic of and I guess a fairly lonely critic of the Pennsylvania grand jury report, I'm interested in your views of some 14 or 15 other state investigations and at least one federal investigation that we're looking toward, which may occupy us over the next who knows how many years. What would you recommend as people who have tried to establish the truth about this, which presumably is also the goal of judicial bodies like investigative grand juries? What would you like to see them do or not do that would help?
As long as they make the data public, then researchers can turn to it and reanalyze it and identify problems. We're working on the Pennsylvania data now to see what we can discern and learn that we have not known before.
And I would just say, along that, I think that you have to, as a scholar, look through a lot of the language that is used in the reports and find that data so that we can take that and compare it to what is known. And that's what we're doing with the Pennsylvania report. And what we found so far is that based on the information in the Pennsylvania report, it follows that same distribution that we found in the Nature and Scope study. So even though they're talking about a large number of individuals who have made allegations of abuse against a large number of priests, what we found is it still fits that exact same distribution that we had in the Nature and Scope study.
It's criminal justice. It's not research. In research, we have ethical protocols that we follow. It's criminal justice. It's bound by statute. It's a different thing. However,
one of the statutes being the statute regarding the secrecy of grand jury proceedings. And I'm very interested in your comment on that, because the grand jury in Pennsylvania report claimed to have subpoenaed and examined 500,000 documents and yet it's impossible even to find out how many times the grand jury met or what the process might have possibly been, who did it, about examining 500,000 documents. So
That's a good question, Peter. I didn't know. We'll have to do further research on that one. I'm sorry.
Peter, could I just throw out a couple of questions in these last few minutes, just summarizing some of the concerns in the audience questions. One is, which comes up a lot for reporters and researchers, what defines a credible or substantiated accusation? These terms seem to have different meanings in different contexts, and how does that help or hinder your work?
Okay, so I try not to use the term credible because the question of substantiation, it happens in the diocese. It isn't me that's making that determination. So the surveys that we received in Nature and Scope, it had a series of questions. Was an investigation taken place after this report was received? Was the report substantiated, not substantiated, found to be not true? Similarly, in the CARA results that are done every year, every new report has to be identified as whether it was investigated, whether it was substantiated. An increasing number in the recent years are found not to be able to be substantiated because the person is no longer with us or the records don't exist. But that is a diocesan process of investigation. I don't know that there would be a typical answer to that. Certainly it would be whether there was evidence that this took place.
I would just add one thing, though, to that, is that in our discussions with individuals within the diocese, very few allegations were excluded because they were deemed to be not credible. So very few were excluded.
Last thing, there are 2 points that always come up in terms of the Catholic clergy abuse crisis: homosexuality and celibacy. Could you summarize your views or your findings on those 2 issues? Is homosexuality a factor, or why not? And is celibacy a factor, or why not?
I would just say that our data do not indicate that homosexuality causes someone to abuse a child. And this is supported by nearly every study that I have read, in the social science literature. And that what we found is that individuals who had a homosexual relationship prior to going into seminary were more likely to have one after seminary, but with an adult, not a minor. Okay, and that people who had identified as a homosexual orientation were no more likely to abuse a minor than someone who had a heterosexual orientation. And the only question that came up in our study was with those who had a confused sexual identity or didn't know how they would identify themselves. And that was largely from a group of individuals who were ordained in the 40s and the 50s. But what our study showed was that individuals with a homosexual orientation were no more likely to abuse a minor than those who did not have one.
I would like to say that the homosexual identity that someone feels for herself or himself is different from homosexual activity. We know from a lot of different sources that human beings are capable of having sexual behavior with males and females. And this is something that is distinct from an identity as a homosexual individual. And so the behavior was homosexual. The persons, not necessarily. Very often, the behavior was homosexual and heterosexual, or included both, or was homosexual with a male adolescent and then heterosexual with a female adult 5 years later. This does not indicate that homosexuality as an identity is an indicator for abuse. And, the Boy Scouts half of the Boy Scout offenders are married. Most of the abuse of, much of the abuse of males comes from stepfathers, heterosexual stepfathers. I mean, everything that we know as social scientists indicates that human beings abuse others, but the nature of a sexual orientation is not a factor. Humans are capable of abusing others, and they do so regularly.
Grim note.
Yeah.
But
Sorry.
reality. I do, Maggie, one thing that struck me that you said when you were talking about the history of the timeline was how in the 80s in seminaries they were beginning to talk about sex, sexual identity, sexuality, and that correlated, hopefully, was a causation of the decline.
Well, that's what our interviewees said, and when we looked at that Eugene Kennedy data we carried out in the 70s, asked how many people were thinking about sex a lot, most of those priests were thinking about sex a lot. I mean, so if there's no way to explore what intimacy means, if there's no way to help yourself develop an intentional lifestyle as a celibate, I mean, these things are the domain of the seminaries. It isn't as though the United States doesn't have any celibate individuals. The surveys tell us that 1/3 of people don't have any sex. I mean, that is what people say. Many people don't have sex, not simply priests who are celibate. I mean, I think that these terms become labels and they become easier answers than the more profound question of how it is that we allow those with power and prestige to abuse those with youth, or those with less power and prestige.
Thank you. And in fact, and again, the talking about it indicates a healthier environment, and the talking about it here is a necessary and healthy thing I would submit to you all. Please join me in thanking our panelists for a terrific presentation. Thank you, Peter.